Well, it's been a while since my last upload. I've been doing a lot of things outside of really just making stuff. I've been failing quite a bit and learning a lot, as you can see on the screen right now. Over the course of 2020, we kind of all changed a lot, I think, during that time. And one of the things that I decided to take on was digital printing and digital sculpting. I took on digital printing to actually learn how to digital sculpt. The sculpting is what kind of drew me into digital printing. I'm not necessarily a big fan of digital printing, but with resin printers and the ability to sculpt on an iPad, that was really enticing to me. And so I've been learning over the course of the last year how to sculpt and print a lot of miniatures. I started with printing, and then I moved on from printing and started sculpting a few things, little engine blocks for cars, and now, as you're seeing here, I'm creating my first miniature. And this is actually in collaboration a little bit of another YouTuber called Creatures, Caverns, and Crafting. I'll link in my below description the link to his channel, and you can kind of check out some of his stuff. But he had a video where he was going over some of his miniatures, and the miniatures had a lot of character, and they reminded me a lot of like the older miniatures, not necessarily the stuff that you see with Warhammer and a lot of the other stuff you see nowadays with, just tons of accoutrements and bells and whistles on them. They were just a very simple sculpt, but they had a ton of character, and that's kind of what I wanted to go to with this guy, is a little bit of a wink and a nod to those older miniatures. And we started talking Creatures, Caverns, and Crafting, and I, on one of his videos, I made a comment, and the comments went back and forth, which turned into some private messaging, and we decided to sculpt a miniature. So this is his concept, and I just took his concept and kind of ran with it and sculpted out a mutant miniature. His idea for this miniature was something that was big-headed and kind of a psionic, psychic kind of thinker, is what he called it. The name of the character is actually the Thinker. It's the big brain kind of a guy with a small body and riding in a shopping cart. And that one sentence kind of sold me, and it was like, okay, I got to make this, because that just sounded too cool. A big brain guy that rides around in a shopping cart. So here we are, and this is Nomad Sculpt. I'm sculpting it on my iPad. And I did it in probably less than a week. I'm really surprised at how fast Nomad Sculpt works. You get some primitive shapes, and you start moving and pushing them around, adding a little clay here, smoothing a little clay there, removing some, and before you know it, you start to get some forms and a miniature. And so this is the very first miniature that I've ever sculpted. I haven't really completed a lot. I've completed a couple little head sculpts that I used for some Lego, but really no full sculpt in miniatures. I was curious to see if you could even do this on the iPad, because a lot of people, I think, will start their sculpt on the iPad with Nomad and maybe finish it in Blender. But with a simple design that I was going for, kind of a wink and a nod to those classic miniatures that you see from the old 80s, 90s Raul Partha stuff. I think I would, I had an idea that I can get away with it. And sculpting a mutant also, I'm not a perfect sculptor by any means. I'm not going to tell myself that I am, but I wanted to take on a project that I could accomplish. And so even though my anatomy knowledge is not as full as it should be, I do know muscles and forms and how to draw and sculpt, but not to a level that you need for sculpting. But with the mutant, it's kind of a good project that you can kind of take on, because if you do have an ear that doesn't look right, like for this instance, his ear doesn't look perfect. it doesn't matter because he's got a huge brain. He's got these legions that are going to be all over his head. It's a mutant. He's deformed, and so if the ear looks a little deformed and out of whack, then hell, that's just more character to the guy. Another thing about sculpting in miniatures that I've noticed is that, you know, you're looking at it on this big iPad, but in reality, when it prints, those ears are hardly going to be noticeable. And so you got to get the form, you got to get kind of the impression of the ear, but you don't need to sculpt it perfect. And so it's something that you can do to learn anatomy, to learn these forms, but not necessarily have to perfect them to the point where you would ruin a sculpt. Yeah, and so that's kind of what's going on here is I block out the forms with a very low poly count. From what I found, like the iPad tends to struggle, at least my iPad. I'm sculpting on an iPad Air 2, the 2020 version with an Apple Pencil. And so the larger poly counts, you know, once you get more detail, the iPad Air starts to struggle a little bit, and I've had it kind of lock up on me a couple of times. So I try to get all of my basic forms down before subdividing these layers and getting the polymer count or the poly count up a little bit more. Another way I cheated is just wrap him in a cloth. I didn't feel like doing the whole body because he's going to be sitting in a shopping cart. So why not just wrap him in a blanket? So I started with a square, and I just started pushing and dragging that square until it looked right. And that's really a lot of my sculpting technique, is just kind of push it around, pull it around, sculpt it around until it looks right. And then I, with the brush, I kind of just sketched in some hands to get the placement. And you can see that it's kind of really choppy and rough. That's that low poly count, because I want to get the forms in before I even do the details. I don't really get high detail until I'm all the way done with the sculpt almost, and then that's when I'll go in and get a little bit more detail. So we're getting a little bit of a hunch kind of back and making it look less like a square and more like something that's kind of draping around. I'm cutting in some wrinkles. I'm really amazed at this app. I'm about 99% sure that it was programmed using some sort of arcane dark magic, because it's for it to do this on the iPad and be able to kind of just sit down on a couch and knock out a miniature in less than a week is really dumbfounding to me, and quite amazing and quite powerful in all the same way. Like, I never thought in all my years that I would be seeing this sort of technology available to, you know, people, that anybody, the general public. Growing up watching Star Wars, you didn't think you'd be able to create those kind of effects in your home, but here we are 20, 30 years later, 40 years later, and we're doing things that George Lucas would only dream of when he was making Star Wars. So, YouTube's probably going to take me down for mentioning the word Star Wars, probably, but it'll be monetized, or who knows. The hands were kind of interesting. I started out with a square, and again, he's a mutant, so if I screw up on the hands or I put a thumb in the wrong place, then that just, hell, he's a mutant. So that's the way he was made. I sculpt one, and then I just duplicate it, and then I just drag it over to the next wrist. That's how I did the ear. That's how I did the eye. That's how I did a lot of it, was I just, I sculpted it and then brought it over to the next. And so after a day or two of sculpting, this is kind of what we got. And it's kind of a nice basic form so far, but we're going to need to go in and add a little bit more detail. And so I started blending the hands together, putting in little veins, and you can see that these hands are far from anatomically correct. And to be honest, I really didn't care. I didn't care how bad they looked. I wanted them to actually look a little bit worse than normal hands anyway. Crumpled and crinkled and veiny and just really distorted. Now you can see that I'm starting to get that poly count up a little bit. I kind of remeshed it so that it's a lot more polys, and I can start getting in some detail. And so I'm defining some of the wrinkles in his face. I'm defining some of the more muscle tones as well, and more kind of a jawbone and more of an eye socket once I get those details in. So I cut it out with the brush, and then I smooth it with the smoothing tool there. And same, I can kind of come in with some creases and start doing some creases. The nose, again, it's one of those features that you need to get proportionally kind of right, but you don't need to get super amount of detail, because when this guy prints, he's only going to be like 28 millimeters tall, if that, and all of that detail is really going to be lost. So why spend the time to do that detail? Especially with, my intention of creating just a classic miniature that would be easy to paint up, and one with just some character that you don't really see that often. So I'm not too concerned with getting creases in the lips or a perfect lip. I want to get the impression of a lip. It's more of an impression kind of driven. And again, that nose is not perfect at all. I just want to kind of get it proportionally right, and I want to get it looking so that it's not really the worst thing you've ever seen. So, right here, I think it's decent enough. It'll pass. If I printed this guy in large scale, then we might want to look into the detail more. But as small as I'm printing him, I don't want to spend a lot of time on detail that I'm never going to be able to see. His head, I wanted to define a little bit more. I found that as I pushed in some holes and kind of defined the top of his forehead versus that big bulge, it created a neat little aesthetic for him. And so I'm just digging in here. I'm constantly kind of moving out and moving back in at this stage just to see where he looks on multiple angles, because we're getting close to having him getting ready to print almost. So, or at least a test print. So I'm digging in some more details. You can see the veins starting to come through right there. And again, like these veins, I think I put in a bunch of veins, but in the end, I don't think many of them actually showed up on the print. They show up just very faintly, but there he is. I actually changed the view a little bit to give it a little bit more contrast, so I can kind of add in a little bit more veins. This is after the first test print, and this is, I think I refined it just a little bit more after this. I added some legions in his head, but this is pretty much where we were at the end. This is the majority of the sculpt. Looked pretty good. And so the last thing we would have to do after I test printed, I painted one up and kind of found a couple things I wanted to adjust, and I adjusted it. And then at the end, you can see there's some legions there that I added right under the neck and right on the top of the head. And I brought out the veins a little bit more, even though they didn't print too much. But I made two different versions of this guy. I'm going to throw them up on Etsy. So I'll throw a link in my Etsy shop below if you want to get a printed version. I'm also going to put them up temporarily on Thingiverse. And so there'll be a link below on Thingiverse where you can download and print this little guy out. A quick print and just a really crappy dry brush just to see kind of how he came out. And this is kind of what he looks like. In scale with another miniature there, you'll see that he's looking pretty good. So it was an overall fun project. If you like what you see, leave a like, leave a comment, leave a subscribe, and hell, if you have an idea, comment below, and maybe we'll who knows where the next inspiration for my miniature will be. So until next time, thank you very much for joining me, and hopefully I'll get back to uploading videos more regularly here in the future. So until then, take care.
you.